Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. My name is Jenny Purdy. I'm the Executive Director of the Tower Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to a very timely program, we believe. First of all, I'd like to start by thanking the Tower Center's executive board members who joined us today, Ambassador Robert Jordan and Rob Ganji. Thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you to all of the Tower Center Forum members who are also joining us today. And if you have questions about how to join our forum, check out our website or talk to any of us before you leave today. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers today for, like I said, something very timely. Sometimes when people speak about migration, they tend to group all people together, even though under that umbrella, even though situations vary and they're very different. Reality is way more complex, and we're going to hear about some of those complexities, especially about what's happening here in the US today. Our first speaker needs little introduction to many of you. He has researched migration for many years, written extensively on the subject. It's also a global fellow of the Wilson Center, but first and foremost, professor of political science and our very own director of the Tower Center, Dr. James F. Hollifield. And our guest speaker today is the director of the Peace Science Society, co-director of the Social Conflict Analysis Database Project, and an expert on international and civil conflict and international migration. Professor of Political Science at UNT. Welcome, Dr. Idean Salehyan. Welcome to both.
Thank you. I think this microphone is working. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm one of these college professors who can't stand to sit or be tied behind a podium. So I'm going to just walk around a little bit up here as I go through this talk. And my colleague, Professor Salehyan, is going to time me. I'm going to try to keep this into about 30 minutes, but cramming everything we need to know about forced migration into a 30-minute lecture is absolutely impossible, as you can imagine. But, I want to get into it fairly quickly, but I do want to thank Professor Salehyan for making the effort to come all the way down here from Denton. I'm sure many of you have made that drive before, and it's even in the middle of the morning, it's not all that easy to do. And I have to say, I've known Professor Salehyan for over 25 years. He was the undergraduate research assistant in a center where I worked at the University of California at San Diego. I think he was like 18 years old at that point in time. We had a big National Science Foundation project, and I never thought we would both end up here working in North Texas, but it's been an absolute delight, for me to have Idean here as a colleague in the area. And I'm sure he will hold my feet to the fire and ask some tough questions and guide us through the discussion. So you can see from the title of my talk that we're going to look at people who are driven out. What does that mean to be driven out? There are many things that force people to move, but we're talking about people, if they don't move, if they don't leave where they are, they're probably going to perish. So it's a matter of life and death for many of these people. And I'm sure some of you in the room, I see some of my students here. Some of you are refugees. You've been through this process. You know what it's like to be uprooted, to lose your family, have to leave kith and kin and go to a faraway place and start a life all over again. So, and I have to put in a plug. Some of the students in here are being forced to read these books, but there are several new books, and somewhere on the table out there we have flyers for the books if you want to follow up on this. And all three of these books, this is just one of them. You can see that this one is co-authored with my great friend and colleague, Professor Foley, in the history department here. He would be here with us today, but he's actually teaching a class, imagine that, doing his class rather than coming to this lecture. So we miss him. There are two other books you will see out flyers for. One of them I worked on with Dr. Pio Renius. I'm teaching a class right now with her on migration here at SMU. She's a vice president of the Dallas Fed. And the other book, I don't see Caroline here today. She's now retired, that I did with Professor Battelle called Migration Theory. So have a look at those flyers. I also should mention that I am a co-chair of a project to look at refugees and forced displacement at the Wilson Center. So on the flyer and on the website, you will see a link to this project. It's called RAFDI, R-A-F-D-I. I would encourage you to go there, look at some of the articles. We just put out a couple of new policy briefs. All right, let me now plunge into the topic. I'm not sure the pointer is working, but I'll be lucky if I get through point 1 and 2. I mean, just looking at the numbers, what's happening today in terms of forced migration, it is changing daily, weekly. The numbers are going up. So we're going to plunge into a discussion of the numbers, and hopefully you will take away from this a good context, the historical context of what's happening. I will get into the politics, the complex politics of migration. I think it was the Prime Minister of Italy recently, Giorgia Meloni, who said, I've dealt with a lot of difficult problems in my life and my political career, but I've never seen anything as complicated or difficult as migration. And several of the students who are in the room here, we all went to Washington, D.C. last week and visited on Capitol Hill in the various departments. And I think if you get a chance to talk to them, they can tell you just how complicated and difficult the politics of this issue is. Okay, the numbers. Here, just try to get your mind around the levels of global migration, international migration. These numbers are already a little out of date. We're close to 300 million people now. What is a migrant? These are numbers, these people are counted by the United Nations. A migrant is someone, an international migrant is someone who has left their country of birth and lived outside of that country for a year. So that's how you become an international migrant. And these are about 300 million. You may be surprised, or maybe not so surprised, to see that the largest number of migrants is actually in Europe. Europe, of course, counts not just Western Europe, but Eastern Europe, Russia, and so forth. Right behind Europe is Asia. One of the big differences, and this is something to think about, between Asia and Europe is most of the migrants in Asia are people moving around within Asia. The migrants that are in Europe are coming from very far afield, all over. And following in third place, of course, here in Northern America. And we are seeing an increasing number of people coming here from different parts of the world. I'll come back to that in just a minute. So that's just looking at the numbers. Here's another chart, something I want you to think about. Get your mind around this. We often think of migration as something that's only happening from the southern hemisphere going into the northern hemisphere, from the poor countries to the wealthier countries. But you can see that now most migration is actually happening in the southern hemisphere. So people are moving from poorer, less developed countries in the south to other less developed countries in the south. So this is a new trend. And don't forget, people do move around within the north. So we have these different strands of migration. You don't have so many people moving from the north to the south. So those are just the trends. Why are the trends up? Well, the global population, looking from 1985 to 2020, was up about 60%. So we have a lot more people today than we used to, from 4.9 to 7.8 billion. And international migration has increased by 150%. So it's increasing faster than the global population. Still, however, keep in mind that when you look at the total migrant population, it's only 3.5% of the global population, the total population. So the vast majority of people on the planet, they do not move. They stay pretty close to where they were born. So migration is still the exception, not the rule. And of course, we know that Canada and the US together, we are the most popular destinations. We have 20% of the global migrants who are coming just to Canada and the United States, even though we're only 5% of the global population. And Canada, of course, has a very specific kind of immigration system where they choose people on the basis of points. Just looking at the US, we have averaged about 1 million migrants per year, going back really into the 80s, early 90s. And the final thing I want to mention, which is what we're going to talk about today, is forced migration to the global south. People who are driven out often by conflict. You know, Idean is a great scholar of conflict and how it affects populations. He's teaching a course, I think, on climate and migration right now, so he'll tell us more about that. And of course, all the natural disasters that play a big role in the movement of people. I'm going to skip over some of this, but just when you think about why people move, obviously people move for economic reasons. There are demand pull forces, supply push forces. And if anyone asks you, why did Mexicans start immigrating to the United States? You know about the Bracero program. We went and recruited millions of Mexicans to come here and work because of the demand for Mexicans. Eventually, the population of Mexico really exploded in the 70s and 80s. So you see supply push forces. And it is a lot easier to move if you have networks. I don't know how many of you are migrants in here, but if you've got family who can welcome you, networks that can help you. I mean, one of the problems right now with the Venezuelans is that they're a new migrant group and they don't have big networks here to help take care of them. So unlike the Mexicans and the Central Americans who've been immigrating here for decades, so the Venezuelans are sort of on their own when they arrive. They don't have the networks. But these are the sufficient conditions for migration to occur, necessary conditions. The sufficient conditions are still political. And just remember that every state under international law has the right to control who enters the state. They're not supposed to stop people from leaving. If you look at the UN Declaration of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, it guarantees that you have a right to leave your country. That's a basic human right. But if you think about it for a minute, it's a pretty hollow human right if you don't have anywhere to go. So there's no right, concomitant right for you to enter a country. So the exceptions to this rule have to do with refugees. And the Refugee Convention, I'll talk more about that in just a minute, which was adopted in 1951. And it was just for Europe when the Refugee Convention was set up, because we had so many people who had been displaced who were on the move in Europe. It wasn't extended to the rest of the world until 1967 through the protocol to this convention. And it's based on this idea of a well-founded fear of persecution. Talk a bit more about that in just a minute. And this unpronounceable French word, legal technical term, which is non-refoulement. In French, on ne peut pas être refoulé. You cannot be sent back if you are fleeing persecution and your life is in danger. Under this treaty, you're supposed to be given the right to claim asylum and have a hearing. Okay, so again, I think I will go through this fairly quickly, but migration, I mentioned a minute ago that it's the exception, not the rule, but historically, people always move. It wasn't until you see the advent of the European nation-state system. If those of you who studied international relations, we often go back to the 30 Years' War, 1648, when the nation-state itself was created. And of course, the nation-state system would spread around the globe from Europe through conquest and settlement. One of my favorite expressions, if you talk to people who have had to flee or migrate, often they say, "We are here because you were there." So there is a colonial imperial element to this, which goes back to the building and expansion of European empires. And of course, in the 20th century, The 17th and the 19th century were relatively free periods. We were talking about this in class the other day. What kind of immigration system did the US have before 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act? Migration was basically open. It was free. The states were involved in this a little bit, but the federal government had nothing really to do with controlling migration. So it was a much more open system. All of this began to change very dramatically in the 20th century when we see the closure of states, we see wars, genocide, and I'm going to talk a lot about this humanitarian, what I call a humanitarian turn after World War II. And that's what we've been living with today. I already mentioned the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Okay, here are some numbers. I'm going to try to move quickly. These are also, this chart is a little bit out of date, but at least it gives you an idea of who are the people of concern. These are people counted by the UNHCR. I actually worked at UNHCR at one point in my career in the early 1990s. I can talk about that during the discussion if you want. But these is the breakdown of people of concern up through 2019. You can see a lot of people in the green category are internally displaced. Those are people who have not crossed an international border. They have been displaced within their country, and it is a dominant group. You can see the dark blue numbers here. These are people who are refugees. They have been granted refugee status. So they have a legal claim to be a refugee. You can see that asylum seekers are actually a fairly small number of this group. This is the black group here on the edge. And then who are these light blue people? Does anyone know what that is? UNRWA? This has been in the news a lot recently. A few years ago, I gave a talk and nobody had ever heard of UNRWA. They didn't know what it was. This is the UN Refugee Works Administration. And those are the Palestinians who have been counted as refugees since the 1948 displacement. And then we got a new category of people that the UN doesn't know what to do with them. And these are the Venezuelans. They haven't really decided how to think about the Venezuelans in legal terms. This chart here is very good because it shows you the tremendous rise in internally displaced people. And we need to really bore down. I hope Idean will help us think about why so many people are being displaced internally. It is just soaring here in the 2010s. And again, you can see the refugees also going up. Don't forget, there's a category of people called stateless people. Say more about them in a minute. Asylum seekers and others of concern. Again, here's a nice chart that shows how the gradual progression, the numbers were up to 108 million in 2023. So more and more people are being displaced globally. And this is a very important chart because this breaks down the numbers, the current numbers as of the end of I think this is 2023. So 108.4 million people of concern. That is about 1% of the global population. So we're still, in proportional terms, we're still not talking about that many people. 29.4 million refugees, 5.4 million asylum seekers. That's about 5% of the total. 62.5 million people internally displaced. That's 58%. 5.9 million Palestinians. That number obviously is going up. And then about 4.4 million stateless people. Look at the Venezuelans. This is Venezuela has 30-some million people. Over 7 million have left. So I want you to get your mind around that and think about what is going on in Venezuela. Why is everyone trying to leave Venezuela? And again, the UN doesn't really know how to categorize the Venezuelans. 6.5 million Ukrainians have been displaced. So the two biggest crises right now in the world are number one, Ukraine, and number two, Venezuela, I would say. And it's important to note that until the Ukrainian exodus, about 86% of the people of concern, they were all in the global south, not in the global north. So they were in regions that were under conflict, and they're seeking refuge in states that are not often, don't have the ability really to take care of so many people. If you take out the Ukrainian, or if you add the Ukrainians, it's now about 75% in the global south. So again, the prominence of internally displaced people, I think I will not spend a whole lot of time on this slide, but I do want you to look at this point right here about displacement. And you might want to make a note of this, especially the students who are here. Just because you have been displaced, forcibly displaced, that whether it's for civil war, poverty, deprivation, desperation, or whatever, that does not automatically qualify you for refugee status. Getting refugee status is a very, very specific thing, and it's a very narrow thing, legally speaking. So what we're looking at are a lot of people who are on the move, who really often have nowhere to go, and no one to take care of them, and they really don't have the chance to claim a refugee status. Here, again, just look at this picture. You know, what is the most difficult and troubled place in the world in terms of displacement? You can see it's clearly Africa. Africa and the Middle East are areas with enormous amounts of displacement. You can look at the countries that are involved. I'll come back to that in just a moment. South Asia, obviously another place. Which group has been displaced in South Asia? The Afghans, obviously millions of Afghans who have been displaced. And from Myanmar, Burma, the Rohingya have been displaced. The biggest displacement crisis in the Western Hemisphere, as we know, is, of course, Venezuela. Well, forced migration, again, I'm not going to read this entire slide to you, but I do want you to understand a couple of things about this. Most people who, I mean, if you're fleeing and you manage to get into a northern country which has signed the Geneva Convention, and you ask for asylum, and we know this because of what's happening in our country today, this is a very complicated and long legal process. It's going to require a hearing. It's all going to be adjudicated on an individual basis, so it's done de jure, to use the Latin term. But the vast majority of people in the world who are refugees, they are basically have fled as a group, and they've been accepted, you know, as a group of people, sometimes in the millions. If you look at the refugee camps in Kenya, for example, you know, the Dadaab refugee camp has something like 1 million people in it. The Kenyans are not going through and asking each of these people whether they are seeking asylum. The UN is going to be there trying to help process these people and get them resettled. So a lot of the displacement in the world is de facto, not de jure. And of course, we can see that Europe is now facing something that many other regions of the world have faced, with the Ukrainians suddenly being uprooted and displaced. We have not seen a crisis like this in Europe since the Second World War. With that many people who have been uprooted and displaced, we're up to almost 7 million people now. You have to go back to the end of World War II to see those levels of displacement in Europe. And of course, the largest displaced population at the end of World War II, the Jews had to flee. Those who survived could get to Israel and elsewhere, Palestine. But the Germans, there were tens of millions of Germans who were uprooted and displaced after World War II. So we haven't seen anything like that in Europe since the end of the Second World War. And today, of course, I was going to just point out that we've been lucky. This may be hard for you to get your mind around, but we've been lucky in this hemisphere in previous decades because we have not faced the kind of mass displacement that the Europeans have been dealing with, that they've been dealing with in South Asia and in Africa and the Middle East. we are getting a taste now of what the Europeans have been dealing with for decades. And of course, we see there are a lot of Venezuelans, Cubans, and others who have been displaced. I'm going to move fairly quickly because I want to leave time for Idean to ask some questions. Turkey, and Idean, I want you to weigh in on this slide here because it's already a little bit out of date. But if you look at the countries that are hosting the largest numbers of refugees, Turkey, my colleague, Dr. Atesh over here, can talk about that. He's from Turkey, is hosting almost 4 million people. That's a lot of people in a country the size of Turkey, which has about a population of about 80 million. Colombia, where are these people coming from? They're coming from Venezuela. The Colombians are hosting almost 2 million Venezuelans. I want you to try to get your mind around that. And what I wanted to ask Professor Salehyan about, if you look at a more up-to-date version of this, Iran has now catapulted, I think, almost up right next to Turkey, in part because the Iranians changed the way they were counting refugees in Iran. So I'd love to hear more about that. Uganda. Look at the numbers of people in Uganda. I don't know if anyone has been to Uganda, knows about Uganda. But just imagine how difficult it is for the Ugandans to take care of that many people. Pakistan. Pakistan decided a few months ago that they're going to send all the Afghans home. And of course, this has created a big crisis for Afghanistan and Iran, because a lot of people may then move to Iran. The only country in the West that's up there is actually Germany. And I'll talk a bit more about Germany as I go along in the talk here. Bangladesh, Lebanon. Again, just a takeaway from this. 1 in 4 people in Lebanon is a refugee. 1 in 4 people in tiny little Lebanon is a refugee. So when we think about how tough we've got it in this country, I want you to think about Lebanon and what Lebanon has had to deal with. Here you can see the global distribution of refugees. You can see North America doesn't have that many. It's growing in Latin America because of the Venezuelans. But look at Europe, look at Turkey, look at Iran, Pakistan, Africa. This is where the displacement crisis is. I know everybody thinks we're in the worst possible situation now on the southern border, but just think about what the Africans, people in the Middle East and Europe have been dealing with for decades, really, for decades. Which countries are hosting the most refugees, are mapping the world's refugee population? Venezuela, Central America, the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, Somalia, Myanmar, Eritrea, Afghanistan, and of course, Syria. Syria, which fell into a tremendous civil war. I know our Syrian colleague is sitting back here in the back somewhere. Maybe she'll ask a question. This is our student, Hala Anouk. So if you look at what's been going on in Europe over the past roughly not quite 20 years, you can see that the Europeans had a very large spike in asylum seeking in 2015-16. Then it tapered off. It has been coming back up again in recent years. And here's another statistic for you. I want you to think about this when you go home tonight and think about the fact that Germany took, in 2015-16, Germany took about 1.2 or 3% of its population as refugees and asylum seekers. So the Germans absorbed a very large number of asylum seekers, many of them coming from Syria and other countries in the crescent of instability from West Africa all the way across to South Asia. Right now, in this year, we have taken about 0.7% of our population in terms of refugees. So we still have a ways to go to experience what the Germans did in 2015-16. That chart is too complicated to look at, really, but you can see how the numbers have come down very dramatically since 2016. And if you want to know why they came down, we can get into that in the discussion. Here's a chart for you. Now, these are refugees, not asylum seekers. You can see that You can see that in terms of refugee admissions, what were the big refugee periods of refugee movement going back to the 70s? Does anyone know where all these refugees were coming to from the US in the 70s? They were coming from Vietnam. That was the last really big influx, and there were millions of Vietnamese who were forced to flee. We have 1980. One reason 1980 stands out, there was something called Mariel. You remember the Marielitos? These were the Cubans. We were really hammering on the Cubans to open up and let people leave, and Castro said, okay. He opened the door. He emptied the prisons, the asylum, insane asylums, and we had 30,000 Cubans that arrived virtually overnight. And of course, here during the Cold War period of the 90s, we also had very high numbers of refugees. We had quite a few coming in the 2000s. And of course, you can see the numbers almost virtually disappear when we get to 2018. You can see that again here. The numbers went down, and there are two reasons why the numbers of refugees collapsed. One of them is something called a pandemic. We closed off our borders, and the other is Trump. Trump decided he wanted to take refugee admissions to zero, basically. And he got them down to about, I think, 15,000 or something like that, which was far fewer than. Here you can see how dramatically the numbers of refugees fell off. Look, going back to what we saw in the 90s and where we ended up here during the Trump period, 2018, 2020, the beginning of the pandemic. And migrant encounters at the US-Mexico border, there's a lot of discussion about this. You can see that just if you look at the encounters, we're now higher than we have been since 2000. The numbers keep going up. What is a migrant encounter? Does anybody know what that means? We used to talk about migrant apprehensions. An encounter means that the Border Patrol has stopped a migrant and perhaps pushed them back across the border, or maybe tried to process them. But these are incidents. So they often double count, triple count people because you have a lot of recidivism. People push back and then they come back again across the border. So it's hard to know exactly how to interpret these numbers, but there's no question the numbers are way, way up compared to what they were earlier in the 21st century. Here, again, a chart to think about. You can see that the green are Mexicans. And here you can see that in 2021 and 22 and 23, the numbers are even higher. The numbers of people who are coming in, it's not just Mexicans. They're coming from all over the place, especially in the Western Hemisphere. This is the newest, most up-to-date numbers from the Department of Homeland Security. And it breaks down the large number of migrants coming from the Western Hemisphere. Mexico is still a big source. Honduras, Salvador, Guatemala, and of course you can see Cuba and the Venezuelans are a very large part of this. And at the very top, you can see the Haitians continuing to come. So most of these people are still coming from the Western Hemisphere, but I'm sure a lot of you read the stories about 50,000 Chinese who made it to the US southern border. That's only a fraction of the numbers, but it is disconcerting that so many Chinese would find ways to get to the southern border and cross the border and ask for asylum. All right, let's see, I think I'm gonna try to stop in about five minutes. So I will take a few minutes here to just give you a quick course about what I call the complex politics of migration. And the former Speaker of the House of Representatives, Tip O'Neill, some of you may remember the great big guy from Massachusetts who was for many, many years the Speaker of the House. They were pressuring him in 1986 to let the 1986 bill come to the floor of the House of Representatives. If you look at what's going on right now in the House of Representatives, the Speaker of the House has an enormous amount of power. They can block any bill from coming to the floor of the House, and the current Speaker is blocking everything. Well, Tip O'Neill did not want to bring the 1986 law to the floor. And he looked at the people who were pressuring him to do this, and he said, "Gentlemen, immigration is political death," he said. "If you open that can of worms, that Pandora's box, it's just going to be a huge mess. Everybody will be upset. Everybody will be angry." So migration is a very, very complicated problem. I like to, and if I'm famous for anything I've written, I put out this idea of what I call a liberal paradox. Our societies, our liberal societies, and by that I mean open societies, open economies, free market economies, where we respect human and civil rights, we need people. So the economic logic, if you look at the labor market now, I don't have time to go into this, we need probably, we're like 10 million people short in our labor market, even though we've taken over 2 million people in the past year. We still have extraordinary labor shortages in this country. So there's always pressure, if there are any business people in here, there's always pressure to open up and take more people. We need the workers. So that's the logic, the economic logic. But we know that you cannot simply open the borders, because we live in nation states, and then we live in a liberal state, a liberal democracy, and that depends on the social contract. So we have to know who are our citizens, who is the demos, who gets to participate. You can't simply throw open the borders. I was on a TV show a few days ago, and there was an economist from the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. Some of you may know about Cato. It's the great libertarian institute, and this libertarian economist said, just open the borders. Let people come in. Let the markets decide. Well, we can't do that. It would undermine the social contract and undermine the institutions of citizenship and sovereignty. So this is a paradox. I want you to think about that paradox. How do you square that circle if you are a politician? And I think I'm going to stop with a couple of more slides here so that we can discuss this. Immigration or migration politics, it is a four-dimensional game. It's a four-dimensional game. When you start down this track, you're going to be pulled in the direction of markets. Business people need migrants. In 1996, the law that came before Congress was going to severely restrict high-skilled migration. And some guy named Bill Gates at Microsoft, he sent a team of 100 lawyers to Washington, D.C. to lobby and stop the Congress from doing that. So there's always the pressure of markets. But you also have to remember that if you're going to let people in a liberal democracy like this one, you're going to have to think about what status they have. What kind of rights are you going to give them? If you try to fudge that, then you're going to end up in the mess that we're in today with 10 or 12 million people working here without papers. And that, of course, is bad. It's bad for the migrants, and it undermines our social contract. So if migration is already complicated enough, how many people are you going to take? What rights are you going to give them? Just try answering those questions. Think about how hard that is. But then what happens when you have a 9/11? When you have migrants that commit an attack, or the many terrorist attacks that we've seen in Europe? When you add the security dimension to this, and of course there's a drumbeat today about how dangerous these migrants are. We can get into a discussion about that if you want, but there's always a security dimension looming out there. And of course in Europe, you have a very strong fear of Islam, an Islamophobia element of this. And that, of course, then gets us into the cultural, ideational, the identity questions. And that has been a constant debate throughout American history. You know, how many people should we take? What kind of mix of people should we be letting in? What should be their culture, their ethnicity, their religion? You know, these are debates that make it even more complicated. So a four-dimensional game. Imagine trying to play a game, a chess game, in 4 dimensions. That's already hard enough. But it's also a game that happens on 3 different levels. So we're not just talking about being pulled in 4 different directions. We're talking about a game that has to be played on 3 different levels. So think about that, how complicated this is. Obviously, we're focused on the national debate, the national level. But if you don't remember anything from this lecture, just remember everything we do in this country with respect to migration, it affects our neighbor in Mexico, it affects Central America, it affects Latin America, and the rest of the world. So it has a very important international dimension to it. And of course, is there any politics going on in Texas about this? I know I saw today that the Attorney General is going to shut down Annunciation House in El Paso, which is a big Catholic institution. I would say the biggest NGO in the world taking care of refugees and displaced people is the Roman Catholic Church. It is just amazing what the church has done over the years. So there's a huge local, state and local dimension to this. So you can see just how complicated this is. I'm just going to show you a few pictures and then I'm going to stop. I love this picture here, it shows you exactly what I was talking about with the liberal paradox. And I know you probably don't read the German, but it says, für 16 Mark einen Italiener. For 60 marks, you can buy yourself an Italian. This was in 1960. Look at all those Italian guys there at the train station in Munich. Don't they look happy? I mean, they're coming to work in Germany and make a lot of money. But of course, we know that these people are not, they're worth more than 60 marks. They're people, they are not commodities. I love this quote here from the famous Swiss writer Max Frisch, who said, when the Swiss were taking guest workers in the 50s and 60s, he said, and again, I apologize for my horrible German, wir riefen Arbeitskräfte und es kamen Menschen. We asked for workers and we got people instead. Human beings came. So you have to remember that people are not shirts. You know, they are not shirts. You know, they are very different from commodities. So when you're talking about people, you're not just talking about a unit of labor. You're talking about people. So again, I don't have time to go through much more of this, but I hope I have at least piqued your imagination and your curiosity about this, got you thinking about it. I could go on and talk about the Ukrainians and the Venezuelans. I have a whole set of slides about them, but I think in the interest of time, it's already 1 o'clock. I should stop here and let Professor Salehyan ask me some tough questions, and then we're going to open it up to you in the audience. So thank you very much. There we go.
All right, thank you, Jim, for a wonderful discussion of the forced migration crisis around the world. I'm just going to ask one question because I'm sure you're eager to hear from our esteemed audience here. But you know, we are here in Texas. It is an election year.
Yep.
The so-called asylum crisis on the border has been unprecedented. You showed numbers about the number of encounters on the U.S.-Mexico border. Many of these people, an unprecedented number, are seeking asylum rather than trying to come in clandestinely.
Right.
And this has created national headlines. Of course, there was the impeachment of Alejandro Mayorkas.
Yeah.
Is this issue to what extent is this issue and the continuation of the crisis on the border the Achilles heel of the Biden administration and something that's going to really drive votes in a meaningful way in November?
Yeah, I'm often very jealous of my colleague, Dr. Arrhenius at the Fed, who has to constantly give updates on economics. And I was laughing the other day when she gave her economic outlook to several thousand people. She said, I'm talking about economics, not about politics here. Can't say anything about politics. But you know, the politics of this, as you can imagine, is very complicated. It's very delicate. And it has become a tremendous symbolic issue. In political science, we talk about the importance of symbolic politics. So it's an issue that can clearly be used for political gain, and politicians are clever in the way in which they use this issue. We've seen this going on in Europe for decades. We have seen it frequently in this country. Going back throughout our history, we've had outbreaks of nativist politics. I often like to point out that, do you remember our founding father, Benjamin Franklin? He said, we can't have any more Germans coming into this country. He said the Germans are a swarthy people. They're coming from a sort of backward peasant society. They will never make good Americans. They can never assimilate. Franklin actually changed his mind about this because there were so many Germans coming into Pennsylvania, the state that he ended up representing. So he overcame his objection to the Germans. I don't even want to get into the way the Irish were treated. There's a great story about an young African-American man who left his farm in South Carolina and moved to New York City. And he wrote back home to his relatives in South Carolina, and he said, you've got to come to this place, New York City. He said, it's the most amazing place. It's an open place. I've never seen this kind of freedom before. Never have this kind of freedom back home in South Carolina. And he said, you know what? I met the Irish and they're white, he said. So, I mean, immigration is a very, it's a hot button issue, an emotional issue, but there's no question that we have a major humanitarian crisis at our southern border, and we're going to have to do something about this. We've got to find a way to get this under control. I know all of you have been following the debates that have been going on in Congress. We came pretty close with a bipartisan bill that was put forward in the Senate. But the former president said he did not want to see that bill pass. So it's now being blocked. It was blocked both in the Senate and in the House. And just a couple of things about U.S. immigration policy. There's something called the plenary power doctrine, that the only way to change immigration policy and law in this country is through legislation. It's the Congress that has the authority to do that. That's been true for way over 100 years. The Congress, the federal government, has the authority to do it. But what happens when the Congress simply cannot function, it cannot pass legislation? Then you get the states involved, you get the cities involved, you get the president involved trying to solve some of these problems. You know, the DACA program that was put in place by President Obama to try to help the people who were brought here as children, to give them some kind of status so they could live here, go to school, work here. That's very controversial. Does the president have the authority to do that? How are we going to deal with people who are requesting asylum? If you go on the RAFTI website, you will see I wrote a policy brief about this. And the sad reality is, to get a handle on this level of movement, it's going to require very close cooperation with your neighbors, in this case, Mexico. You can't imagine what's going on behind the scenes between the Biden administration and the Mexican government. If you look in the past month, the numbers coming to the border have almost fallen by half. Could you ask what happened? Why are people not coming in the numbers they did before? A lot of very quiet, serious things are happening in Mexico to stop the caravans, to stop the people moving north. And this is close cooperation between Mexico and the United States. If you look at those numbers in Europe, the huge spike in immigration in 2015-16, does anyone remember how the Europeans got a handle on this, Professor Atesh? Where were these people coming through? They were coming through Turkey. And of course, the President Erdogan in Turkey said, hey, you guys want help? You know, I need things too. He wanted visa-free travel for his Turkish citizens. Yeah, he wanted better deals with the EU, and he wanted money. The EU paid him like $3-4 billion, or euros, I should say, to stop the flow of Syrians and others coming through Turkey. So you will see, and right now the EU is doing the same thing in North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. You may remember, or maybe you don't remember, there was a military coup in Niger, the former French colony in West Africa. Why was the civilian government overthrown there? Because the civilian government, the president had struck a deal with the EU to stop the migrant smuggling through Niger into Libya and on to Europe. Who was the beneficiary? Who was getting the money from the migrant smuggling? It was the military. And the military leader said, hey, wait a minute, you're cutting off our main source of income and revenue here. So they simply overthrew the government. So you can see how this works in terms of geopolitics. Just two final things, and then we should open it up for discussion. We have seen increasingly, and sadly, I should say, the weaponization of migration. Migrants increasingly used as pawns in political games, cynical games. Probably the best person at doing this, you'll be surprised or not surprised to hear, this is Vladimir Putin and Mr. Lukashenko in Belarus. They have brought hundreds of thousands of migrants. They have brought them to the eastern frontiers of the EU, and they're pushing them across the border into Poland and Finland. Because the Russians know, this is a weak spot in the politics of Europe. If we can just push more migrants in there, then it's going to further, splinter, fragment the politics in these countries. It will weaken our adversaries. So we have seen the weaponization of migration in geopolitical terms. Sorry. Questions?
Well, quickly, you did ask me about the Iranians. So the Iranians host over 2 million Afghan refugees, but they're not under the care of the UN, and they're not formally recognized as refugees, which is opens up a whole set of questions about who gets counted as a refugee and the politics of even granting refugee status. So we open it up to the floor for your questions.
Jim, you made an interesting comment about countries who are getting exposed to migrants. For example, sending them to Turkey, Trump's policy of remain in Mexico, Biden's attempt to have them stay in Venezuela.
Yep.
But are there countries who have adopted programs of getting them assimilated in the country in which they come? How does that work? And what do you think the solutions are for that?
Well, is anybody from Colombia in here? Colombia deserves many silver stars and medals, for what they have done. I mean, they have taken 2 million Venezuelans. They've simply given them permits, said, okay, you're going to stay here until this crisis abates. We're going to let you work. We're going to let you assimilate into Colombian society. But that's a very rare thing. And of course, the Venezuelans and the Colombians are pretty closely connected culturally, linguistically, and so forth. So Colombia has done that. I mean, again, Ray, you know a lot about the Middle East. I mean, if you look at how Lebanon, for example, has taken, so many Syrians and Iraqis and other refugees, little tiny Lebanon. And, the people are able to come. It's a very dangerous, delicate place, but they've been able to find refuge and to live there. Many countries in Africa, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, these are countries that have welcomed millions of refugees. Unfortunately, very often those people are bottled up in camps. So, and that's really the worst arrangement, because you can have people that might have to spend their entire youth, 10, 15 years locked up in a camp, waiting to see if they can get out, be resettled somewhere. If you get a chance to go on the Wilson Center website, the director of the Rafti program is a great colleague who is originally from Sudan, a Sudanese refugee named Jonathan Majok. He spent he spent 10 years of his life in a camp in Kenya before the UNHCR finally got him and said, okay, you're going to send you to America. You're going to be resettled. We're going to send you to Arizona. He ended up going to the University of Arizona, getting a degree, coming to Washington, getting a graduate degree, and now running major programs at the Wilson Center. So you can escape from these situations, but it's incredibly difficult. And the worst outcome, especially if you look in the Middle East, I'd like to hear Professor Atesh's view on this. If you bottle people up in these refugee camps for generation after generation, I mean, you're creating a pressure cooker. You know, it will explode at some point, and you will create a new generation of jihadis and terrorists. You know, so yeah.
Getting the education of ISIS, and international community is not taking responsibility. But thank you for the microphone. I have actually a question too. So a friend of mine, kind of continuing with what you said, created a organization called Tent because he was an immigrant himself. And now he's bringing 400, he brought actually together already, and it's now becoming global, 400 global companies. And he says there is a solution to this crisis. We have to train those people so that they can assimilate. Of course, he got a lot of complaints about what he does. But another thing he's doing with White House, as far as I know, White House has this program called Northern Tier, I guess you would know better. So they are trying to create jobs and opportunities in the host countries. So my question to you is US politics, right? Internationalism versus kinds of isolationism. Do you think if countries like US be more active internationally and try to push for more democracy, more human rights, and wars, and try to solve the problem at the source rather than at the border, will that be a solution? The other one, maybe for Dr. Salehyan, we talked about the environment, and we talk about wars, but what about environmental refugees? And are they going to be the bigger?
We haven't talked about climate and the role of climate in this, and I know Professor Salehyan has worked extensively on this, but just quickly to answer your question, and again, to get you thinking about this, what do you do with these people? I mean, people who have been displaced, there are only three options if you think about it. One option is that they can be repatriated. If you wait long enough, maybe things will settle down. And there's a very successful example of this with the Bosnians, for example. You know, I think 500,000 or maybe even close to 1 million people fled Bosnia during the wars there in Germany and elsewhere. Eventually things calmed down in Bosnia and many of those people went back to Bosnia. So that's one option, is to repatriate people. And often that's one of the reasons why the states will, and the international community will let people be bottled up in one place, because the hope is that things will calm down, they'll still be close to home, and then they can go back where they came from. If that's not going to work, what are the other options? Well, the most difficult option is to resettle these people. So you have to choose them and decide who is going to get to be resettled, and that is a job that the United Nations High Commission for Refugee, working with the International Organization of Migration, you know, they help to resettle people. And the U.S. historically, we were taking how many a year? 170,000 a year. So we were doing our part up until fairly recently, when we tried to cut the numbers almost to zero. So it's not good when a big wealthy country like the U.S. turns its back on all these people. And I would say two things about turning your back and not helping to share the burden or the responsibility for people who've been displaced. I want you to think about what happens when my neighbor's house is on fire. And you simply say, well, that's not my problem. You know, I shouldn't have to deal with that. Well, fires have a tendency to spread. They can destabilize, you know, entire regions. So it's really in the interest of the United States to help and participate in helping to resolve these issues. The third option, which we've already mentioned, what's the third option? You can't repatriate them. They can't all be resettled. So they're going to have to be integrated and allowed to stay, allowed to settle, to find a new life, and to put down roots. So, you know, those are the three options that you're looking at. I don't know, Idean, do you want to, before we take more questions, you want to say something about the whole climate issue?
Well, the climate issue we haven't even touched on, and that could be a whole lecture, so maybe you'll invite me back to talk about it. But there simply isn't an international framework for dealing with people displaced by natural disasters. There is not. Various countries have offered temporary solutions. We have temporary protected status in the United States, but under international law, there's this clear differentiation between economic or voluntary migrants and forced migrants that are forced because of persecution or war, but we don't have an international framework for people displaced by natural disasters. There have been attempts to create a framework, but most countries, especially in the global north, want nothing to do with it. So we're really just muddling through at the moment.
And just to drive home that point, there is no legal category for, there's no such thing as a climate refugee. It does not exist under international law. I was trying to move my slides back around, but apparently the PowerPoint is turned off or frozen. But I do want you to remember that the grounds for asylum, the grounds for becoming a refugee are very specific. They are very narrow. So you have to have a well-founded fear of persecution on the basis of race, ethnicity, nationality, because you're a member of perhaps of a political party or a club that's being persecuted. And in order to get asylum, you have to show that the state that you're fleeing from is unwilling to protect you. Maybe the state is persecuting you, or the state simply can't protect you. And you know, when you narrow those criteria down, it's very, very narrow. So it will be amazing if 10%, if we reach 10% of the people who have come in here, if they go through this long process, we'll be lucky if, they will be lucky if 10% of them actually end up getting asylum. So, but then the question is, you know, what do you do with them? They've been here for years, they put down roots, they're going to marry perhaps a native, they're going to have children. How do you deal with that? Yeah. Richard.
It's not a bad dream. You wake up tomorrow morning and you're president. What do you do about the immigration situation? And you can't say you resign.
Let's see, where I think most of my students have probably left and gone on to we have a project going on in the Tower Scholars Program. The students have to design a new immigration policy for North America. Yeah, that's the reaction of a lot of my students. I see only one of them up there, and we went off to Washington. They're all, you know, very optimistic, wide-eyed, and idealistic. And we went to Capitol Hill, and they're like, "Oh my God, you know, this is going to be impossible." You know, when you talk to the different sides on this issue. Well, I mean, I know you've, Richard and others, you probably have heard this before. There's a guy who sits over on the other side of campus here named George W. Bush who told me that the worst thing that he did in his second term, he had this idea of privatizing Social Security. You can imagine how far that got. But he said, I should have pursued comprehensive immigration reform. That was my big mistake. I should have spent all the political capital I had to reform American immigration policy. And I think anybody who's thought about this for a hot minute knows we need a major overhaul of our immigration system. It's too bad my colleague, Dr. Arrhenius, is not with us here. She's an economist, bless her heart. You know, economists are very, they're also very optimistic, utopian thinkers, you know, that we get the markets to solve these issues. But she has a very good point. You know, 65% of the people we let into this country legally are coming through the family window. So we need to let a lot more people come here to work in this country. We need more legal pathways for people to come and work here. And that's what my students are working on that project to see if we can design a policy proposal that would make it easier for people to move around from Central America, Mexico into this country and Canada to create a kind of North American labor market, something like more of what we see with the integrated labor market in Europe. So, Economically, this is pretty straightforward, but Richard, to your point, politically, you know, you go back to my picture, you know, how do you square this circle? And if you talk to Americans about this issue, I think you'll be surprised what you find in the public opinion polls. Americans, by and large, support immigration. They're pretty positive about it. They think it's a good thing. What they don't like is what they perceive as illegal immigration. You know, where people are violating the law, undermining the rule of law, and you know they've got a point. But if your laws are broken, Richard, you know we're pretty clever people, the American people. If we've got laws that are just broken, that are not functioning, don't you think it might be time to revisit those laws and perhaps change the laws in some fundamental way? So we need to create a lot more pathways for people to get here legally. The Biden administration has been trying desperately to do that with the new apps and everything, but with the numbers, they simply have been unable to keep up with this. And, you know, so we need to play on the support that the American people have for immigration. We need to go back to you know, that more positive narrative about us being a nation of immigrants. I firmly believe in that. And of course, we always have to be vigilant to make sure that we're not letting people, individuals, and it's really often just individuals. You can't paint entire groups with the same brush. You know, all Muslims are not terrorists. We all know that and understand that. But you don't want to let people into the country who are going to do damage, harm, attack us. We once, many years ago, we had the American Consul General from Hamburg, Germany, who came to visit us here at SMU. And he was retiring from the State Department. And it was his office in Hamburg that let, I think, 11 of the 9/11 hijackers into the United States. Do you want to be that consul, that official that lets the, so we have to constantly be vigilant on this. And the final thing I will say about this is, I have discovered, like I made the comment about the African-American guy and the Irish, if we just get people to relax a little bit about this and smile about it and think about it. You know, one of my favorite stories, I got to give you this story of all times from Texas history and Texas politics. You may remember governors, a couple, Ma and Pa Ferguson. You remember them in the 1920s, and Pa got impeached. I think they threw him in jail, and he was succeeded by his wife, Ma. And they were having a big debate about English being the official language of the state of Texas. And Ma made a speech, and she said, well, if English was good enough for our Lord Jesus Christ, it's good enough for the people of the great state of Texas. So again, you just have to, you've got to put some of this into perspective. I'm looking at my Palestinian colleague in the back over there. You know, okay, let's take a couple more questions. You know, I think we've got to get the Congress to move on this issue.
So if we have laws that govern the definition of asylum, and we don't have definition of climate asylum or any of the other categories, those are international laws. How do those categories get created, and what body administers them? I mean, does the U.S. just say, yes, we agree with the UN?
Yeah.
How
well,
do those things get, how do you make that happen?
Yeah, well, I won't get my colleague Idean on this, but just remember, in 1980, I was actually sitting in Washington, D.C. with the woman who was instrumental in getting this law passed. In 1980, we passed the Refugee Act in the United States. And the Congress incorporated the international law, the asylum clause, and the asylum process was put into American law. So when you criticize the administration for doing what it's doing. It's following the law. You know, this is what's there in the 1980 Refugee Act. We put it into our law. And of course, we created a large bureaucracy, not nearly big enough, you know, to deal with this. We have a lot of judges that are immigration judges that are dedicated to hear these asylum cases. We're not prepared for the numbers that we're looking at now. To go back to Richard's point, one way we might think about approaching this current crisis, Richard, if I were president, I would say, okay, we've still got a lot of people coming in, the last in, the first out. You know, I would start processing people, the last ones that come in, quick hearing, if you're not qualifying for asylum, you go back, you're deported. So, and by the way, that's what we did in the 1990s when we had a similar crisis. And there was a guy named Bill Clinton, you know, who did that in the 90s. So it can be done, but don't forget, to go back to your question, this is in American law. I mean, the president swears to uphold the Constitution, to follow the law. So we're not getting rid of the asylum.
What mechanism is used to create climate asylum or the other category?
Okay, well, I'm going to let Professor Salehyan answer that one.
Yeah, so that would have to be legislation.
Yeah.
So currently what the United States does, if there's a natural disaster in an origin country, we can grant temporary protected status. So we've
Yeah.
done that in the past for Haitians after the earthquake, or in Central America following hurricanes in the Caribbean. And that grants just a temporary stay of deportation if their visa should expire.
Yep.
But it doesn't confer, it doesn't come with it or accrue to permanent residency or to citizenship. So for that to change, to have something, a meaningful pathway for people escaping natural disasters to come to the United States, that would have to be legislated by Congress and
Yep.
then signed by the
Yep.
president. The prospect of that happening anytime soon is virtually nil.
Yeah, we have something here called humanitarian parole, and we have temporary protected status. So we do have ways of dealing with large numbers of people, just to deal with the immediate crisis. And the Europeans put a similar law in place, a directive, I think it was in about 2000, in the early 2000s, for temporary protection. And the Europeans had never really used that until they were faced with millions of Ukrainians. So they simply had to say, okay, this is a desperate situation. We're going to let the Ukrainians in. We're going to let them stay. We're going to let them work. We're not going to give them, residency, permanent residency, but we're not going to deport them. We're going to let them stay. So that's an example of what I was talking about, where suddenly you have millions of people that show up on your border, and you have to make a decision. What are we going to do with these people? The Europeans, they were not going to push the Ukrainians back into the battle, into combat. And by the way, most of the Ukrainians who fled, they were mostly women and children and older men, because all the young men are forced to stay there and fight. Just one quick anecdote. I remember talking to the deputy chief of mission, the #2 guy in the German embassy, when the Germans were taking so many people in 2015-16. And I'll never forget what he said to me. He said, we've got several 100,000 people, sitting on the German border, with Austria. What are we going to do with these people? We can't round them up. Imagine if the Germans had put them in concentration camps. How would that look? So we had to let them in. We had to let them in, and we had to take care of them. And then, of course, we have to find an answer to this, the hemorrhaging of people. And this goes back to Professor Atesh's point. How do you deal with the root causes of migration? That is a big long-term question. It's a long-term issue. I've got a whole series of lectures just about that. But that's what you've got to look at. How are we going to stop the situation in Venezuela? Have any of you thought about that? How did the Venezuelans get into the mess that they're in today? It had something to do with a guy named Chavez, I think, who really destroyed the economy and destroyed the society. And, we put big, heavy sanctions on Venezuela. We've got big, heavy sanctions on Cuba that have been in place since the Cuban Revolution. Has that resolved the problem or the issue? No, it has not. Does that mean that we're going to lift the sanctions? Not so sure about that. Would that be a good move? Biden started quietly to talk with the Venezuelans. You know, let's see if we can help you out here, lift some of the sanctions. What did Maduro do? He began to round up and arrest all of the opponents. He went in exactly the opposite direction. So now we're back to square one. So there are no easy answers or solutions to this. But in the long term, yeah, you're going to have two things. I want you to remember this. You're going to have really good international cooperation, regional cooperation. We're going to have to develop a North American and a hemispheric policy with respect to displacement, refugees, and asylum seekers. We're going to have to do that. We can't do this alone. Building a wall along the border is not going to resolve this issue, this crisis. I'm sorry to tell you that. There's no easy unilateral solution to this. The second thing that we're going to have to do is, again, get the regional cooperation and go to what's happening in the countries that are having the biggest problems. The U.S., we have enormous amounts of resources. We have a lot of power. We have a lot of leverage. You know, we need to be using that strategically to help move the hemisphere in a direction where you're going to have better prospects, you know, for prosperity. And we can get back to migration, which I like to say can be a virtuous cycle that will lead to greater human development, greater wealth. What we don't want to do is get into this vicious cycle, you know, where it just feeds on itself. And countries, then societies begin to close down, and you make the situation 10 times worse. Okay, well, I think we could go on all afternoon here, but thank you.